We now continue looking at Immanuel Kant's theory of knowledge. Now, one of the things that Kant is noted for, among many others, is his Transcendent Method. Now, this involved a rejection of a key part of empiricism. The historical empiricists attempted to engage in a generalization from particular facts to these generalizations. Now, Hume, an empiricist who argued quite a bit against empiricism in terms of presenting problems for it, he argued that the limits of experience entail that when we generalize, the results will be inconclusive. So from this, Kant concludes that this method of the empiricist will be useless in trying to establish knowledge of the world that is both universal and necessary. So rather than doing what Hume does, which essentially is kind of saying this can't be done and giving up, he develops his Transcendent Method. And here's how the method works. It begins with the nature of experience itself, looking at it in general, and then moving to the necessary conditions of the possibility of that experience. These transcendental structures of experience are those formal features that are not limited to any particular experience, but are universal and necessary features of all experiences. So the way Kant tests this is in the following way. If you can't imagine an experience without a certain structural feature, then that gives you a reason to accept that that structural feature is necessary for that experience. For example, if we make spatial judgments about experience, judgments about our experiences that seem to involve space, then we must have minds that structure experience spatially. As another example, if we can make causal judgments about cause and effect, then we must have minds that structure experience in causal terms, or so he reasons. So how do we handle things like space and time? Now, scientific knowledge, as Kant sees it, deals with objects in space and time. So to understand how we know the world, and Kant assumes we do, this requires understanding how we can experience objects spatially and temporally. So what Kant does is claim that space and time are not objects of experience. So we don't actually experience objects, space, the object, time. So then what are they to be? Well, what he claims is this. These are basic frames of reference in terms of which objects appear to us. And here's terminology, translated into English, of course, is he calls them the forms of intuition. So how would space work? Well, what he claims is this. We can imagine empty space without objects. You can try that. Just imagine emptiness with nothing in it. But he claims we can't imagine objects without space. And so you could look at it as a challenge. Can you imagine an object without any space? And he claims you can't. These spatial qualities differ from qualities in objects of sensation. So space, for him, is a form of the mind that arranges sensations, but is not itself a sensation. So you don't have a sensation, according to him, of space. It is a form of the mind that is arranging these sensations spatially. So we don't actually experience space. What we experience, according to him, is objects that are spatially structured. So space, as he sees it, is the form of the outer sense because it structures our experience of external objects, as he sees it. So that's how space works for Kant. Now, what about time? Interestingly, for him, time is not a thing that exists in the world. It is, rather like space, a form in which objects appear to humans. Time is the form of inner sense, because mental states necessarily occur to us in temporal sequences, at least according to Kant. Now, this has some interesting metaphysical implications regarding, time and perception. He uses, for example, some accounts of God, such as our good dead friend St. Augustine's, that place God beyond time. And so one way to account for, say, the notion that God knows everything, and to account for the notion of, say, prophecy, being able to, know the future, and prophecy is usually in a religious context, a good question is, how can that work? How can God know what we're going to do without, causing us to do it? And this is often used in the context, as you might imagine, of free will. That's to say, how can God know you're going to do something, yet you're freely able to do it, yet God knows that you're going to do it? And this notion of time allows it to be accounted for. So here's how it would work. And this stuff is not, Kant talking about how free will works in this context. This is just some implications for this. And so the way God could see time is that for him, past, present, and future are experienced simultaneously. So we experience time in sequence. The past is behind us, metaphorically speaking, the present is now, and the future is forever out of reach. Because no matter when you are, you're always now. But for God, of course, since he doesn't experience time like that, he sees, experiences past, present, and future. You really can't say all at once because that would be a time thing, but he experiences them all. To use an analogy, imagine you had a film. And of course, when we watch a film, we see it, play out. But imagine you could see the strip of film laid out and see all the things that are going to happen and have happened. In other words, you don't have to play the film to see it. You can see all the cells. And that would be like how God, at least according to Kant, could view time. So for him, the past, present, and future are not, what has been, what is, and what shall be. In a way, it's all the same to God. So he would know exactly what you're going to do, but he doesn't have to make you do it. So you could have free will. So since God is seeing what we call the future, he would see what you're going to do, because from his standpoint, you did it, are going to do it, and are doing it, because all time is all the same. So this also allows for some interesting implications for other intelligent beings other than us and God. Other creatures might have very different perceptions of time. So interestingly, in Kant, you could have some interesting foundation for like science fiction about creatures that are intelligent, but experience, matters quite differently. That their form of space, their form of time is different from ours. Now, Kant is also very concerned with mathematics. So one reason he develops his account of space and time takes us back to, where we kind of began here, which is he's trying to explain how mathematical judgments are synthetic a priori. That is to say, they tell us about the world, but they're prior to experience. Now, in the case of geometry, he takes that to be a science of spatial properties. And he claims math is a method of processing numbers, and so it must involve time. So, as he sees it, by linking math and geometry to space and time, and by showing that space and time are universal and necessary structures of how we humans experience the world, he thinks he's able to retain the a priori character of math, that is to say, knowledge prior to experience, while he also believes that this proves that it provides information about the world studied by science. So he thinks that he has achieved the possibility of synthetic a priori in math, and that in geometry as well. That it tells us about, the world, or rather how we experience the world, but it's prior to experience. And this can be seen as brilliant or kind of a clever, cheat. Continuing his theory of knowledge, we now look at Kant's categories of the understanding. Now, as he sees it, or saw it since he's pretty dead, knowledge comes from sensibility and understanding. Not sensibility like in, being sensible, but in the sense of sensing stuff. Now, Kant does consider, in a kind of a common move for Kant, they might come from a common but unknown root. He often takes the view that things that seem rather different are actually somehow the same. But anyways, moving on. So the objects we have are given to us by sensibility, again, our senses. And then we think about these objects with our understanding. So Kant explains this sensibility in terms of how sense experience is structured by the forms of intuition of space and time. Now, if we, humans, if we only had a mechanism of perception, then we'd only have spatially and temporally located sensations, and we wouldn't know stuff. Roughly put, it would be like a very simple living organism, just not having these sensations but not knowing things. So knowledge for him requires additional principles of organization, and these are contained, or so he thinks, within the understanding. So knowledge, then, is the result of the sensibility and understanding working in tandem, a team-up, as it were. So without sensibility, without the senses pulling in stuff, we would have no objects, and without understanding, no object would be thought. And to quote Kant, again translated into English, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. The understanding can intuit nothing, the senses can think nothing. Only through their union can knowledge arise. So knowledge for him consists of judgments expressible as propositions, statements that are either true or false. Now to concepts. As Kant saw it, the understanding organizes experience using pure concepts, or what he calls categories of the understanding. The concepts are pure for him because they are a priori, prior to experience. And so to figure out the mind's categories, he starts off by cataloging what he takes to be our judgments. And to do this, he uses Aristotle's logic, which he considered, incorrectly, the final development of logic. And he ends up discovering 12 types of judgments. And so the influence from Aristotle here is pretty clear. And so he thinks that we can deduce the concepts necessary for these judgments. So what are these 12 a priori concepts? Well, they're these. And he takes these 12 to make up the nature of any possible object. So they're exhaustive. They're also a priori. We don't derive them from experience. They are the way the mind represents experience. And here they are. There's quantity, which for him consists of or includes unity, plurality, and totality. So that would be essentially one, many, all. Then there's quality, which consists of reality, negation, limitation. Lastly is modality, which deals with possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, and necessity and contingency. And modality is rather interesting because it gets into, notions of like what is possible, what is not, and this kind of eventually gets into discussions of what philosophers and people who do fiction like to call, possible worlds or alternative realities. And so when philosophers talk about modality, they're talking about, in the context of this, what is possible, what is impossible, what is necessary, what is contingent. And something that's possible can be, something that's impossible can never be. What exists, exists. What doesn't exist, doesn't. And necessity is something that must be. Not in the sense that, you really gotta have it, but in the sense that it must, in the case of existence, it must exist. So, for example, it's often argued that God is a necessary being. Not only does he exist, but it's impossible for him not to exist. And we can also talk about qualities being necessary. For example, that triangles of necessity have three sides, meaning that you cannot have a triangle that doesn't have three sides. Contingency means it could be otherwise. So a contingent being could exist but doesn't have to. It's a contingent fact, for example, that a triangle is blue. Because it doesn't have to be blue, it could be orange and still be a triangle. So that concludes Immanuel Kant's theory of knowledge.